Yeah. Oh, oh, missed you last week, Beth.
Oh, thank you.
Were you all right?
Yes, yes. No, I had something pre-organized, so
Oh, I know. I forgot it. I forgot it twice. I forgot. I'll have to phone me up.
no, I did let him know. So yeah.
It's the middle of the week, so middle of the week, you sort of I don't know. It's sort of a build up of doing things, and then you can't really stop. But I we go to class on Thursday, so I think, oh well, that's my stop, where I stop and I just have an afternoon to myself, well, to archaeology company.
Yeah.
Hello, Pat.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
I went to see my mother-in-law today.
Where is she?
She's in in Bethel House in Dinas Powys.
Oh, yes.
Care home there, and God, she's so good, she's just, if anyone would thrive in a care home, it's Joan, my mother-in-law,
Oh.
she's just so good with groups, I think, she's very quiet. She's very quiet, but I think she feels very secure, with the routine and the sort of the nice. The girls are all very nice there, They're very caring. So we took her for coffee. But she's from Lancashire, you see, so she's a fish out of water, really.
Oh.
But thank goodness for Coronation Street, they all recognise her voice, But she's not a bit Coronation Streety, but anyway. What did he say? Carl said something then. Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi. Anne, any news this week?
Well, I've been very interested in the Nice Glass Castle again, near where I lived as a child. And we're thinking that we know where the castle was, and it was underneath the estate. And we think that the tump, which everyone thought was the castle, might be just a folly, in a sort of memory of, or like a memorial,
Yeah.
And they might have put some stones and some stuff there, but it'd be interesting to find out because everybody thought it was the castle.
Yeah. Yeah, I've read about that, about a lot of people theorising that it's a castle, and this is so little is written about it. I think more should be written about. It'd be nice to see if you come out with any more information.
Yeah, my brother's got a map of a tithe map of 1922, and might have been. It was 1922, and he's going to try and get a map of 1933. That was just before Maze Glass was built.
Yeah.
So, we want to see if that tump was there then,
Yeah.
or whether, I got a feeling it was. I think everybody knew about it, but we think that maybe, there was a bit of artistic license went on there.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting, Annie. I'll have to think back with that. Thank you. Pat, any news this week?
No, just hanging in there.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Richard, any news this week?
No, nothing really.
No, that's fine. Beth?
No, sorry, nothing.
No, that's fine. Well, I know there's been a few things found recently by metal detectorists, and it's encouraged people to go out with a metal detector at the moment, which is caused a bit of a debate, but two metal detectorists near Temby had found two brooches from the medieval period, the early medieval period, and they're really well preserved. And Mark Redknapp, who's an archaeologist well known in medieval archaeology, has said that this shows us how fashion is, how it was in the medieval period. And I think they're fantastic finds. I know they're being taken by the National Museum of Wales, so hopefully they can post things online, because they do some nice coverage of things sometimes, things that you wouldn't be able to find on a basic search. I think my favourite thing that they've done is the burial of 639, I think. Might be a different number, but it was an individual buried in Landock, and their coverage of that burial was fantastic as well. So they do come out with some fantastic things. We'll have to look out for that. But it's nice they've been collected and appreciated as well. So I'll get into today's class. Last week we done manuscripts and killer bunnies and snails and what they meant, and I thought I'll go back to the archaeology of just buildings and churches, etc., and just looking at the Viking period today. So it's a different feel, but I think we'll all like it. So if I can get it to start from the beginning. Oh, there you go. So today we're looking at medieval Anglesey, something that I have touched upon before in my research for my master's, and something that I've been looking into a little bit as well, so more recently. So I think it'd be nice to look at some of the things that I will talk about today and just see how important this area is in the medieval period, especially in the early medieval period as well. So so we'll start off with an introduction to ease everyone in. There's a lot of archaeology in Anglesey that is fantastic. It's really well preserved and allows us to have an insight of a lot of periods. There's a lot of prehistoric monuments and a lot of Roman, post-Roman and later medieval. And the medieval period is obviously the focus because it's a medieval bunch of classes, but I think it helps us provide an insight to Anglesey and how it's important in the medieval period in terms of economy, in terms of identity, in terms of religion, and just influences from other cultures as well. It seems to be almost a cosmopolitan sort of area where they're having a mixture of lots of different groups of people coming. And I know Gwynfor Evans talks about this area quite strongly in his book about 2,000 years worth of history. It's a big chunky book, but he shows how Anglesey has had this strong relationship with Ireland as well, and helps provide a better insight of how well connected Wales is. And going from Anglesey has inspired other people to look at South Wales and other areas of Wales as well. So it's almost it gives you a taste of things such as trade and identity, etc., and you can compare them and relate them with other areas. So this is a fantastic area to focus on, and it's something that I have mentioned, but it is an important location for trade, especially with the Vikings, and we see how there's so many cultures mixing in with this area throughout the medieval period that has helped develop Anglesey to be what it is now. And just looking at the structures that they have that go from a wide range of periods, I think is fantastic that they're still there, and there's something that you can still connect with and touch, and even the fact that there's legends connected with them makes them even more magical, and definitely something that would be fantastic to possibly have a trip to in the future, etc., because the archaeology there is absolutely fantastic, and I think it shows us the changes and developments of this area and help archaeologists and historians understand the story of Wales through the medieval period. And there is a lot being written about Anglesey online, which makes me really happy. A lot of academic papers, blogs, websites are actually posting about this, and allows people to have a better sense of the period, a more wider reading sources to actually ensure that everyone has the right information. So I do think Anglesey has had a lot of good press and a lot of good coverage that we can actually have an understanding. So that's what my focus will be on today. If my mouse wants to work, it always likes to wind me up. So this is just one area that I want to focus on. There is a book that I have been looking into that gives me an understanding of this period and what's so important about this location. And when you look at this location, you start to have a sense of how strong Christianity is in the identity of the people that lived in this area. And the archaeology is absolutely amazing, as you can see from this image here. I don't know if I can get a pen. This is part of a monastery that's here as well, which is also a church at one point. You see how there's a lot of phases in this area, how we can see early Christianity mixed in with Celtic influence as well as Viking. We also see the legends put into their art as well. And I think this just shows how there's a growing tendency to form these monasteries as well in these remote places, because this fitted the lifestyle, the look. And I think it also allowed monks, for example, to actually have this life of solitude. And I think this is where we see theology really develop. There's a lot of theology from the later medieval period, but from the early medieval period is where it all sort of starts. It's almost like a seed has been planted. And we see how this is a very strong presence in the medieval period and has helped form the period as well. So we see in the 6th century that there's a rise in early Christianity in the early medieval period in Wales. And so during this time, there was 2 monasteries that was formed at the opposite ends of Anglesey by 2 friends, Cyril and Sibby. St Sibby's monastery was at the heart of what is now Holyhead. And this just shows how there's now a story, there's a legend that's come along with this area. And I think that's what makes it even more magical to people, is that there's a story and a legend with it. And I think that's one thing I like about Welsh archaeology as well, is how there's always some sort of legend or myth or story behind all of it, especially in terms of religion, that I think it gives us more of a connection of the identity and the people, because these would have been stories that would have been passed down to each person in the period. So it was almost like you having that story passed down to you. It's like you're reliving what's going on back then. I'm probably thinking too much into it, but that's always what I used to be like. Just actually being able to stand in these structures as well and have a sense of them, I think that also allows you to time travel in a way. I wish that would be a thing, because I think I would just be in my element. Never mind holidays, I think I would just be going back and forth time. But actually visiting these sites allows you to do that in some sort of way. There is a historian called Christina Gilbert, and she talks about this queer touch. It means to actually touch the archaeology and history, to have this tangible evidence that gives us a stronger connection with it as well, which is, I think, something that we can experience with this area as well. And I think the fact that it has got a strong religious presence as well shows that there's more of a sense of spirituality about, and more this is like a magical sense that's going on, but definitely something that would be absolutely blessed to live in. And one thing that is notable here is the dovecot that they have here, which is from the 1600s. And you just see how this area has an importance throughout the period, right up until the what they consider modern history era as well. So you can definitely see how this area has this strong importance still tied with it. And that's something that I think is absolutely fantastic. But this is the legend of these 2 saints who would meet weekly near this area. and it was near the centre of the island of St. Sibi, which would walk from Holyhead facing the rising sun into the morning and setting sun in the evening. And there was this Saint Soriol was travelling in the opposite direction, who would have had the sun on his back during his journey, and he was known as Sibi the Dark because he was tanned. And I think it just gives us more of an idea and a sense of how they're trying to write their history through stories and legends. And I think that's definitely something that we see, how the Vikings can almost get along with these people in this area, because is this appreciation for legends and this sort of magic, and this sort of, you do get a sense of magic whenever you hear both of each culture's legends, and I think that's why they got along so well as well. And definitely in this area, I think when you see other cultures interacting with this area, you definitely see how they're there's more of a tolerance, so that they're happy to actually allow influences to their identity. And I think it's because they understood the importance of this in terms of development and trade. And I think it highlights to me how Wales is definitely an area that is not backwards, is definitely an area that understood how to progress further. We do definitely look upon something in the post-Norman conquest era, and just how we see their presence of the Normans actually coming into this area. And I think it's just a strange thing, really, because you don't really see much bloodshed really going on here too much. We do touch upon something like that in a little bit, but one thing I think is important to note is that it seems like the Normans really took intimidation to a very high level. This castle that you see is very well built, very strong, and you understand the reason as to why they're doing it, but you can see that definitely the Normans didn't really have much of a struggle going on, because they were able to create these fantastic structures. But I think no matter how strong the Norman presence was there, we definitely still have these legends surviving in all of these structures, which I think is absolutely fantastic and important to note, because it just shows how strong the identity is of the Celtic people and the Welsh people in this area as well. So looking at this area, you definitely have this sense that, looking at the book that I have of it, it just makes you feel a bit, it's a little bit magical, and it just, that's how I feel. I can imagine some fantastic scenes going on there of individuals, people of the community, monks actually talking and having the creation of theology slowly starting to develop. I just think lots of things here, and I just think that this is a perfect area for the focus of historians and archaeologists to actually understand what medieval Wales was like. And it definitely would be quite interesting to compare this area with South Wales and see how they differ in identity, how they differ in trade, how they differ in their economy. And I know the economy is something that historians definitely struggle with. There's one historian from my university, his name's Matthew Stevens. He wrote a book, and it's very recent, I think it was 2019, and it was The Economy of Wales. And he definitely, as a historian, is focusing on documents, he's focusing on things that are written and said. But one thing that I liked and definitely loved to see from him that was very different from other historians who looked at trade and the economy was that he was able to bring in some archaeology. It wasn't as much as I would have hoped, but he was able to bring archaeology in. And I think that's definitely something that historians are starting to realise now, is that documents and legends are important. I'm looking at manuscripts. However, looking at the archaeology of religion, of trade, etc., will allow historians to further expand on their arguments. So this is definitely something that I think should be focused on more. So if I go to this part here, this is thought to be the earliest site here in the area, and I think it definitely shows how, again, this sense of of magic, really, how people would go to this area to go and heal themselves. And it is argued by a lot of people how this is thought to be a place of healing. And if you basically, the book that I have, it puts you on a little journey. So there is a map in the back of it, and it does give you a road route to actually go around the whole area and look at everything. And they give you clear directions on how to go to this. But I don't think you could miss something like this as well. But you see how these remains of a monastic fish pond on the right as you approach the well. And some people have argued in further literature that this fish pond is evidence of just living there and having food and sustenance as well. But this is where you start to see this fantastic planning, this monastic planning, and how things like this are important for worship. And one thing that I've read about historians is that things like this also indicate a possible site of early Christian worship as well, because they believe that these high crosses that are found on the site or nearby would have also been placed around these areas. A lot of people have seen this as a place of pilgrimages as well. You can imagine going to this well that heals you. A lot of people go to Lourdes today, so you can see how this could possibly be a Welsh version of it as well. But this is the oldest, and I think this is one of the most fantastic things out of the medieval period to be found here. The doorway is absolutely fantastic as well, and it's fantastic that it's actually stayed there. And they definitely see that this is the oldest because early Christian Celtic churches were associated with a holy well, and so people would come here to heal themselves and almost wash things away, or like washing sins away. And a lot of people do believe that this would have helped them. And I know in the medieval period, religion came quite closely in with medicine. I always talk about how you look at Christ throughout imagery, so from post-Roman all the way up to later medieval period, you see the understanding of medicine as the demeanour of Christ is changed. He's looking weaker and thinner, and he has blue lips, and you almost see signs of rigor mortis in his fingers. And you can relate that the other way. You can see how basically in the medieval period, it was law that if you were to be sick and you went to a doctor straight away, then that doctor would have his license taken off him, his license away, his reputation. And that was the end of his career. He would have had to push someone towards a religious doctor in a way, where it basically would be someone who would be in charge of these wells, for example, and try and heal them and get that sin out of them that was making them be ill and it was affecting their humours. And if it didn't work, then that's when they were allowed to see an actual doctor, which you can definitely see how this would have been problematic for a lot of things in the period. But this fish pond is built by monks. It also shows how there's a lot of things going on here, and it's very fantastic to look at. You can see the remains of it on the actual plan that you can get online. But this is a very small building. I know in the 18th century there was more reconstructions to it, so it has changed a little bit, but the well still stays there. And this is something that's been very important for a lot of people. When you look at the plan of the well, you see how there's some sort of pool, and you have to walk through a chamber firsthand to get to it, which is absolutely fantastic. A lot of thought has gone into this. But in the 1800s, that's when they really saw the importance of actually keep the preservation of this. So I think the importance of preservation in this area of these sites is absolutely fantastic. And you definitely see how this was built in the rock face, and there was a small pool surrounded by a slabbed floor and stone benches in there. And it just shows how this was really well thought out, and there was an experience that went along with it. And I think this is allowing them to draw more people into the religion, into the belief, but also allow people to actually interact with their identity and add to it. And I think also it just helps with trade. I think when you see pilgrimages, you definitely see trade going on as well, because they're having people mixing with things and they're able to sell more things on. So definitely something fantastic to look at, and definitely would be something fantastic to go and visit as well. If you do have a look online, definitely see that there's thought to be a cell that's there for the saints associated with this well, which is quite interesting, because these cells that they have is normally connected to churches, and they're like an anchorite cell, and it's definitely quite unusual that it was a male saint that was doing this, because it was mostly women. But it just shows how, again, like I said, this start of theology is starting. I think it's definitely a start of being an anchorite or a mystic, for example, actually putting yourself in isolation and in these uncomfortable cells to actually reflect and actually connect with God, because they would get themselves into a state where some historians have said that they're hallucinating, which I think, if you say that, it almost invalidates these fantastic works of discussion and theology that have come out of their experiences. But they believe that if they were seeing something, whether it was a hallucination or not, so if, for example, if they were seeing Christ and it was a hallucination, they're still touching them, they're still interacting with Christ, because the medieval eye theory was that it's not so far off as to now, and we know that it's light bouncing back into our eyes, but back then they felt like our eyes, as soon as we were looking at something, our eyes were going out and grabbing everything and touching it, and that's why we were able to see, because our eyes touched it. So if they were seeing Christ, then they were touching him as well, which that actually sounds quite weird on the retrospect, but you know what I mean.
The windows of the soul.
Yes.
The windows of the soul. So yeah, I don't know where that came from.
No, it's fine, Anne, but it's definitely fantastic how they relate that, really. And I think when you see cells like this is just a theory of mine, but I think it would be nice if someone looked into this really quite deeply. My theory is that if you see anchorite cells, and we know a lot of early medieval manuscripts have gone missing now, or they're destroyed or damaged or just lost to time, but it makes me think of, was there any manuscripts that were made in these cells? Because they were doing a lot of reflecting, and actually writing a manuscript would have allowed them to actually bring out their experiences or bring out their feelings, or even just copying parts of the Bible, etc., could have possibly allowed them to further concentrate on Christ. So it does make me think, was there manuscripts actually being produced here that we no longer know about, which is quite sad to think about. But to me, I feel like these cells have much more of a meaning and purpose as well. But doing something like that allows them to be worthy of God's acceptance, because they've put themselves through so much suffering. And definitely, if you read some of the literature associated with it, you definitely see how these things were also part of pilgrimages. So having a cell near this well would have showed people this individual that was pushing themselves to actually be worthy of God's love, and something that would have been an example for them. And so definitely is something fantastic to think about. There's something like this would have gone on, and that people would have looked at this and looked up in fascination and just admiration of this person as well. And I think that's why we see this saint associated with this well. So this is another thing that's important as well to the area, and you definitely see a lot of people have a lot to say about this. But I think, again, it's something that is fantastic to look at, because you have an understanding of Christianity and the importance in this area. There is a lot of historical backgrounds to this, where you start to see that there's an early Christian monastery that's being built here, and it was built in wood, and that was a bit of mistake to do, but this was something that we see in the medieval period, is that basically, oh, hang on a minute, let my thoughts get to me, is that they started building with timber because there was a lot of woods around them, so it would make sense to use what they had. Stones were used mostly in the Roman period, and it just went out of fashion then, because if it worked, why get rid of it? But obviously when we see the Vikings invading in 971, you see this church burnt to a crisp, in a way, this monastery, which is sad, but they started rebuilding the church in stone, and you see the remains of it there. That's connected to present day church, but this took place throughout the 12th century. And this was a very prosperous period in this area, because it was the period where there was rule of Gruffydd ap Cynan and Owain Gwynedd, which was showing, I think, further the increase of the economy and how well this area was doing. But looking at that, it's definitely something that people do focus on, and it is part of this little tour that you can do around Anglesey. Is something that they focus on. But looking at this, it absolutely is fantastic to look at, because you get a sense of what it is like in the architecture. You see a mixture of stones, and a lot of people have talked about where the quarry is as well, and is something that isn't mentioned on the map here, which is actually be fantastic to actually look at. But this is on the east side, the southeast side of this area. But it's absolutely fantastic to just see this, because again, it's something that you can actually walk through the same doorways as these monks and actually experience the same thing as them. But it was these Viking raids that saw the end of this, really, which is quite sad, and it's a shame, but it definitely shows how this priory was one of the targets. But if we talk about some of, well, there's one thing that I'm going to bring up that could possibly just show that there was a lot of violence on both sides. It wasn't just the Vikings who was bringing violence, but it was the Welsh as well, which we'll look into further. But there was a time of conflict while rebuilding this, and this is why we see a lot of things going backwards. But you definitely see in the Chronicle of Princes, which is a manuscript that you can see in the Library of Wales online, and really well digitized, and you actually can see a translation. But this was written in 855. So it was before the Vikings came, and it does talk about how they're starting to see the presence of Vikings, but it's not as strong. But it was in 971 where this all came to head, and they burnt this church down completely. But you definitely see how there's this is all set out in terms of the plan. But this is in a typical cruciform arrangement, and the nave is the oldest part that we're seeing here. So if I can get the pen out on the plan, is just this area here is the oldest. And it finished around about 1140, and the tower was then built in 1160 to 1170. And again, a lot of people argued of the tower. A lot of people are saying, is it a lookout? A lot of people are saying, is it just purposely for the bell? And a lot of people have even argued, is this a way the monks were able to actually get closer to God by going up there and maybe having some form of meditation? And it does remind me of this place that I went to when I was, I know obviously Christianity has changed a lot since then, but you definitely see some glimpses of medieval thought actually still in Christianity today. And when I was a child in high school, we went on this trip. It was the first year of high school, so they were trying to get everyone to know each other. And we would go to this place where there was, I think there was a monk there, and well, a few of them, but they was also have an area where people could stay, and it was this religious trip that we would go on. And in the evening, we'd go to the top room and speak to God, and actually have this reflection and meditation with all together. And it was thought that being in the top room was allowing us to actually have a closer experience with God, because it was a form of symbolism. Not sure whether this is the same idea, but it'd be nice to actually see a connection with that as well. But this building in stone as well, I think, again, it just shows the importance of actually preserving this church and this monastery, and actually ensuring that it's still in the heart of this area, because it's part of their identity and it's part of who they are. And I think it's something that they don't want to let go of, because without that, their identity is gone, really, because this is their beliefs. And definitely something that the Normans actually took advantage of. You definitely see how some historians talk about how the Normans saw the monasteries as an important target, because they could allow them to actually trade further and have more of a control and power. And so that's why you see these two link up, and it's almost like the Normans were able to take control of their identity as well. But that's just a discussion. But this had there was a refectory here as well that had a large dining hall, cellars and dormitories here, and the three-story building now is roofless, but it is absolutely fantastic to actually look at, because what we're seeing in the image here is the older part is this here, and obviously then you see the rest of the church then hanging out. So is this part here that I've circled, the refectory. And you definitely see how this was an important area for living, and this was built much later than the medieval period. With the medieval part, this actually stayed quite much easier as well, which is absolutely fantastic. But obviously with the dissolution of the monasteries in 1537, you see how this is then this is no longer used for religion. This was just given over to a local landowner, which was the Buckley family, who used this area as a deer park, and much of it was rebuilt in 1855, which is a shame, really. But it's the fact that they're still able to know more about his history just by looking at what people have said, and legends as well is such a strong part of identity and something that cannot be taken away, no matter how strong the influence was from England or the Normans, for example. But this is the most complete building of his age in the northwest of Wales, and definitely something that's important and has attracted a lot of archaeologists and tourists as well. But there's also remains that are found nearby on Puffin Island. It's associated with the saint of the last of the well that we looked at, and it just shows how this area was definitely important along the coast, and I think it allowed them to interact with other people. The coast is an important area to interact with other cultures, and you definitely see how Anglesey really took that in their stride. So if I go to this now, there's these fantastic high crosses that you can find in the area. It's not far. This would have been in the church's grounds. And it's definitely not of all of Anglesey, it's a little part of it. You can definitely see a lot of reconstructions and drawings of this. They allow you to have a sense of what they're like. They're now in the church that I showed you. And this was in the deer park until 1977. I think the smaller one was as well, because they didn't actually give a date on this, which is actually really frustrating to look at. But you see how Celtic artwork in this area is very distinctive, and it allows you to understand the beliefs of those outside the community, beliefs of those in the community, and as well as influences from outside worlds and the legends. And the top one's the most complete one, absolutely fantastic. And you can see, if you look a little bit closer on there, the type of knotwork that's on there. And there's a reconstruction here of it, and it goes quite rectangular, these lines, and then all of a sudden they go into these beautiful knots like a plait all the way down, and it's absolutely fantastic, the craftsmanship. Looking at this, you can see how religion and worship was important to them to put this level of work in. And a lot of people have related this in terms of Ireland and have said, well, maybe if there was a strong relationship with Ireland, then this would be something that was connected, and definitely something people have connected with the Isle of Man as well. And I think this is definitely distinctive the Celtic world and how early Christianity started, these would have been good places to gather around for worship. And I think also good places to actually gather pilgrims together to maybe even talk to them. And could have actually been, well, this is argued by one historian, is a signpost all the way down to the well in the church as well. So you definitely see how this does have some strong influences from the outside world and people that have interacted with them. And the bottom one, obviously, is not completely there, but they've tried having a reconstruction around it of what they think the rest of it would have looked like based on comparing with other high crosses from different areas. And it does remind me of the one that we can see in Llantwit Major, because in the church they have the high cross, and using the glass they've actually reconstructed the rest of the cross to show you what it would have looked like. And I love the fact that these churches are actually respecting this and actually giving this a home in the church, because it shows how it's important still to this day in terms of religion, and how firm this idea of religion in identity has been for this area in Wales. And this was obviously moved for its protection. There's a lot of weathering that had gone on with these crosses, especially the bottom one, which showed that they had to move for protection. But it shows how the decoration is mostly on the shaft, and it just shows a lot of these fret patterns and plaits, like I've said. Is also divided by mouldings, but this interlaced pattern is common in the 10th century as well. And like I said, it embodies a lot of Irish influence, but there's also Scandinavian influence that's coming from this as well, which a lot of people have said that the connections of the Vikings in Wexford and Dublin going all the way over to Chester, they would have stopped off along Anglesey along the way. And this is thought to be carved by a school of craftsmen that's centred in Cheshire as well, so not far. You definitely see this connection going along here with this area of Wales, and you definitely see how there's important trade areas just like South Wales as well. And it's a shame that it's worn so much, because it's difficult to see. But you definitely see how in one of them is the top one, which you can't really see that much, but you definitely see the temptation of Saint Anthony, showing the saint front facing, and you have these animal-headed demons on there, and then you definitely see more animals on the animal and human figures on here as well, which you're not sure on who to actually connect this to. But it's absolutely fantastic, because it's telling you the history and the legends and the stories held so deeply of the people in the period at the time as well. And something, when we went to Chester, you could see all these fantastic stone crosses from with Scandinavian influence, with just Celtic influence, with influence from Ireland, all in the churches, and it's something that the churches find really important. And in fact, it showed me how rich the archaeology is in North Wales and that area on the border between Wales and England as well, because you can see how this was something that was strongly related in their identity and something that they kept close to them. This is something that I think that people should focus on further, because looking at those crosses were absolutely fantastic, and the way these churches show them off, I think it's absolutely, you have a lot of respect for it as well, because they're keeping the history alive with the people. So if my mouse wants to work. This is also something that I just wanted to take note of, that they find here. There's a cast of the memorial of Llan Gwyndor church to Cadfan, King of Gwynedd, who had died in 625. And this inscription that they found in the area indicates the survival of the use of Latin in this time. So a lot of people have argued that there's a lot of evidence to point towards a very strong legacy of the Romans in Wales, definitely seen it in terms of religion, and definitely seeing it in terms of writing as well. And Latin is obviously thought to be quite a religious language to actually speak in, and that's why a lot of monks knew about it. But when you do look at the map of Anglesey, you definitely see a strong Roman influence here as well, and you understand that this would be part of their identity, and is something that they still held part of them. They didn't think of themselves as Roman, it was part of their identity, and I think it was just a way of documenting history to actually adopt it into identity as well, which is absolutely fantastic. So if we look here, this is a very basic map that you can actually see. This is a trade route from the Vikings in Dublin to Chester. But a lot of people have now pointed towards, especially myself, that there's a lot of connection with Bristol to Wexford, stopping off in a number of places in South Wales. And it would have been Wexford to Dublin at one point, all the way to Chester, and they would have stopped at Anglesey here as well, because they're very close. But this is just a very basic map that shows the beginning and the ending of the trade route, and you can definitely connect it with other areas, which we will do. And there's a lot of discussion about trade of livestock. So the Vikings would trade items for livestock. Wales had perfect pastures, and it was perfect for growing crops and livestock. So this was something that they were able to trade with the Vikings. And so this had a strong relationship with not just the Irish now, but the Vikings in Ireland, which is absolutely fantastic, because again, it's almost Wales is developing in their understanding of cultures, in what they're allowing in their identity, and what they're allowing to help them develop, and what helps them actually form their trades and industry. And more is being found about this as we go along, and you see how Anglesey is actually highlighted as an important area within Wales, especially with the Vikings. So something to actually look out for, and something that we will delve deeper into. So one thing that I wanted to look at is this skeleton here. There was a mass burial, so there's only just one of them. You can definitely see how this individual has been buried. And it was found in Anglesey, and the first thing people thought when they saw this was, this is definitely a mass killing by the Vikings on these poor people in this monastery. There was not much there was assumptions going into this investigation before they were actually able to investigate, which is something that you shouldn't do, especially with archaeologists as well. They're meant to be very scientific with a lot of methodologies. So to actually do that was actually a bad step to do. But they did come out and actually say, listen, we found out that they're actually Vikings that are buried. It wasn't the Vikings that actually done this bloodshed. Which is absolutely interesting and fantastic to read about, because you definitely see how history is actually being changed by the archaeology. And I think sometimes historians need to look at archaeologists' work and realise that they can give us more of a definitive yes or no to things, because it's more evidence that can be credible, rather than a document written by one group of people. And it's believed that these individuals that we're looking at, there's one individual as well in particular, because it's only one that we're seeing, but these men spent the first part of their lives in Scandinavia. And so this DNA testing that have allowed them to see this sort of changes the narrative. It shows that these individuals were intermarried here, they settled here, they had good connections and relationships with the people of Anglesey. And is found in this area that they found them in, is thought to be important for manufacture and trades in the 10th century. So something that they should actually focus on a little bit further. But the evidence that they're looking at further expands on the discussion. So it was in 1994 that they discussed this, but it was only recently that they've actually looked back onto all of the information. And they showed that it was, so far they had found in this excavation was 2 adult males and 1 woman was found. But since then they've possibly found more. But again, this was an article that you had to pay for, which was really frustrating. But the bodies that were thought to be victims of Viking raiding were actually Vikings that actually just settled here and just passed away. And this was buried in a shallow grave, and the National Museum of Wales archaeologist says it was very unusual for the period, and it's definitely changed the discussion and interpretation of this period in this area. And that this is showing that there's this non-Christian orientation of the body and its treatment to point to distinction from the burial practices of Christians and other communities during the 10th century. And it shows that these people were not local, and actually they have theories that they started off in Scandinavia in their early life, and then they came to Scotland and interacted there, and then they came down to Wales. So a lot of people have actually thought that there's also a relationship and trade route with the Vikings in Scotland that have actually allowed them to actually settle here as well. But you see how there's a lot of warrior items sort of buried with them. There was a sword that was found there as well. There was a 7th century silver and bronze sword that was found as well. And there was also findings of a brooch that was there as well. So you see how there's a lot of wealth here. And Mark Redknapp, who I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, he had a say on this, and this was showing how this silver that has been found, he's actually argued that this has been traced back to the areas such as Ireland or anywhere else further, but he hasn't actually provided evidence for that, which actually frustrates me. But I know this was just an article that was put online. It wasn't very extensive, but something that Mark Redknapp actually noted was that while they were actually excavating, they found a fragment of a silver coin, and it's an Islamic silver coin. So it shows his trade routes with Central Asia, with Scandinavia and beyond. And maybe shows the importance of this area as well in terms of trade and culture. So the fact that they found this Islamic coin there, a lot of people have connected this with areas such as what we've looked at with France. France had a coin hoard underneath an abbey, like I remember saying, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and there was coins from the Islamic world there as well. So it's definitely showing how there is definitely more of a connection with other worlds, especially the Eastern world, happening here in the West, and something that we're seeing in Wales, which is absolutely fantastic, and to me further highlights the importance of this area for trade and connections with the wider world. So one thing as well that we also see, which is also a big indicator of trade, is these armlets or Viking bands, is what is also said online. And some of these things is quite frustrating when you see things with multiple different names, but they're fantastic to actually look at, and it's something they're able to actually connect with because it comes into the story. This was found in the Red Wharf area in Anglesey, and there was silver armorings of Viking character that were found in the quarry, and they were probably thought to be manufactured in Ireland again, which further shows this connection with Irish, Vikings in Ireland with Wales, and also this relationship with Ireland and Wales. And I think this was something that they would have told the Vikings about, and they actually jumped on the opportunity of trading with them as well. This is thought to be something that would have been accepted into the culture and community of the people of Anglesey, and highlights how the Vikings had an influence on their fashion, on their identity as well, and definitely in the patterns that we see here are absolutely fantastic. And he's also thought that this was also used as a form of currency. Again, it just shows how they're actually adopting things from other cultures as well in order to actually have trade. But there's evidence of this in the National Museum of Wales. And looking at the Chronicle of the Princes, we definitely see how the Irish sea base of Dublin was taken by the Vikings and actually interacting with Anglesey as early as 855. But you definitely see how this was also evidence of raids that ended up with trading as well. So I think the Vikings understood that they could actually benefit from having the Welsh on their side, which is a very wise thing to do, because both sides benefited from this. But the Irish Sea connection was always important to Wales, especially this area, and especially to the second royal dynasty of Gwynedd that emerged in the strong 9th century kings of Merfyn Ferach and Rhodri Mawr, which were the king of the Britons as well. So you definitely see how Ireland's connecting with this, because this is almost seemed to be a centre of the Celtic world. And this then pushes us further to the Norman period, which when you look at the Bayeux tapestry, you see that there's part of them creating these earth and timber castles. But this isn't timber, this is in stone. It's thought that the earlier castle here is built in timber and it is now stone. But a lot of historians have argued that with its impressive size and impressive structure and the amount of towers that they had, it's thought that they actually had little resistance from the Welsh here, because they were so intimidating in this way that the people of Wales here were actually open and were connecting with people from different cultures, like we've seen. So I think they were more happy to actually see where trading would go, and they were taken advantage of. And I don't think that's because the Welsh were naive. I generally think that they had a better, more open-minded look in other cultures, because they allowed them to develop and benefit in terms of economy and trade, and allow them to actually take on further skills. And the Normans had taken advantage of that, and something that historians have noted on is how the Normans have taken advantage of that. This is a symbol of the strength and power of the Normans, and I think this is the reason why they weren't challenged as much as they should been. But this castle is absolutely impressive to look at. You definitely see how there's a motte and bailey going on here. There's an inner and outer wall. Each one would give time to ensure that there was protection to people inside. And one thing here is that we see the domestic buildings here. So this would have been storage, this would have been people's living quarters, and we see more here as well. There would have been kitchens. So they could have lived in this as well, but they were also able to actually protect themselves and actually have this sense of status about them. When you look on the map, this is actually on the coastal area of the southeast of Anglesey. But you definitely see how this was important, because it allowed them to have this connection so close to North Wales, but also take over this small area as well. And I think it worked. There was only one of these big castles from the Normans found in the area, and it allowed them to actually speak a volume that it intimidated the Welsh, I think. But you definitely see how this thought to be a mound, this for a castle, this nearby in the 1090s, but it's something that people discuss. But you can definitely see a mound, but it's now covered full of trees and plants, and not really looked after that much. But this was important because it is a very strange place, but I think the area that it was quite an easy area for any coastal hugging ship to actually connect with the trade. So something that the Normans could have authority over and actually have an influence over as well. But when you see it, it is impressive to look at, and definitely something you'll see as you pass by. And this was part of Edward I's campaign to conquer North Wales in 1282. And this was thought to be constructed in 1284. And it was delayed due to funds to actually, there was lack of funds. And so this was taking longer than usual. And it was 1295 that it was finished. But this was an uprising of Madoc ap Llewellyn that it came about by the time they had built this. So they had built this just in time. And so this showed how this was there was an invasion scare in 1306. So even though they were still doing work, they had to stop this. And the work finally ceased around about 1330, which a total of £15,000 had been spent on this, which was a huge sum for the period. Again, the castle still remained incomplete despite how much money had been pumped into. So even though they had a lot of time, I think it was the fear of an invasion that stopped this castle from actually being as great as it was. But even just looking at it as a glance, it still has an impressive message to it. But it definitely shows how the Welsh are feared, and I think it was something that the Normans understood, that they had to act quickly, but they didn't act quickly enough. And this is on the UNESCO World Heritage Site as well, and is a Grade 1 listed building, so it has a lot of respect. And you definitely see in the 1500s how this was then used for places for people to be imprisoned and hanged. And you see in the English Civil War, this was important. You see how these are recognised as good strategic areas to actually attack and actually ensure that they have power and strength. So I'll go to the conclusion now, which I think we see with Anglesey. It gives us an insight of the importance of Wales in the period. And we can have this new perspective of the Vikings and how they were able to intermarry into society and actually trade and benefit from Wales and vice versa. But I think Anglesey is important because it shows how we can provide evidence of trade and manufacturing of this area, and how it highlights the state of Welsh economy in the medieval period, which is something that is touched upon about Matthew Stevens and even Gwynfor Evans, how this is an important area for connections from people in Scotland, Isle of Wight, with North Wales, with Ireland, and much more. You see how architecture in the Norman period was so impressive, despite it not even being finished, because they had to speak a message from a glance, really. But the uprising of the Welsh showed that the Welsh were not going to sit down and let this happen. They were actually going to fight for their area, and we see how this happens. But you see how these areas of these Norman castles are still important right up into the English Civil War, because they're strategic locations, because it allowed them to actually keep this strength and power and protection on them. And I think they were built to last, and something that the Normans have left a legacy on the identity and the landscape of Anglesey as well, which allows us to have a better understanding of the story of Wales throughout the medieval period. So I'll ask if there's any questions now. So, Anne, anything that you'd like to say?
Oh, it's just that I was interested in the connection of the early saints, you know, and the mythology, and how it, you know, I was talking about Castlemaine's glass, and apparently Saint Gladys, who was Saint Cadoc's mother, had a cell in this area, you know, near the castle. So that was the first Celtic Romano building.
Oh wow!
You know, because she separated from her husband, he more or less had a cell on where St Woolas Church is now, St Woolas Cathedral. So it's a good you know, it's a good story to look up and read, because it's sort of linked in with King Arthur as well. So it's a good read for anyone who's interested in Newport Celto-Romano saints.
I think it's interesting that we still know about these cells, even though they're not present anymore. I know, which is absolutely fantastic. I know Skipton is the only place in Britain that you can actually see an anchorite cell that they found by accident. But I think it's fantastic that we're still keeping them in memory.
Yeah, it has got a fantastic artifacts and buildings in North Wales. It's fantastic to see all this still there. We don't have that in the south as much. You know, we don't, especially if it's an industrial area. You know, there was a well connected to St Gladys, but it's in somewhere else. You know, another part of South Wales, but she was
Yeah.
very connected to Basilisk. There's a church called St Gladys and St Basil's in Basilisk, which is about
Yeah.
2 miles up the river.
Yeah.
It's it's good food for research anyway.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Anne. Also, one thing that I'm not sure if anyone looked at the chat, but Carl's also sent me a message that I need to remind you that if any of you want to continue with these lessons, then you need to renew. This is the last class next week. So I thought I'd give you that information. But thank you for that, Anne. Again, we like these sort of stories that go along with it because I think it shows how, even though they can be erased physically, it's still a strong part of our identity and who we are and our story of our landscape. So thank you, Anne. Richard, anything that you'd like to ask or add?
No, really interesting.
No, thank you.
Can't
Pat?
tend to think much about North Wales, you know. There's some
Yeah,
interesting history up there.
Yeah, it is definitely fantastic, and even just looking at things online, you definitely get a good sense of what's going on there. But I think actually being there physically, you get a different feel for it and a different understanding. Like when we went to Chester, we learned so much more about St John's Church and his ruins just from going there. So it would be fantastic to see if there would be any trip or anything like that in the future for that. So something to take note of. So thank you, Richard. It's definitely something that's fantastic to look at. Beth, anything that you'd like to ask or add?
Yes, just you touched on the Chronicles of the Princes. I didn't quite get that properly. Is it something I can look at? Or...
Yeah, it's in the National Library of Wales. Hang on, let me see if I can get the link up for it now. It's in the National Library of Wales. They put a lot of manuscripts up, and I do believe that they give you a rundown of what's going on. Library. You can definitely have a look at they've digitized it, I believe, so you can actually look at each page quite closely. Yes. Is it going to load for me, or is it going to wind me up? Yes. So if I share screen now, and I'll put the link in here for you, you get a lot of understanding. You can relate this with a lot of Hywel Dda. There is, as you can see, the manuscripts are all on the side. So it's a digital gallery. So instead of people touching these manuscripts now, they think it's better to put them online to preserve them. But you see how there's medieval astronomy. You have the Book of Llandaff. All these fantastic manuscripts. You've got the Chronicle of the Princes here, which loads of Hywel Dda here as well in the Welsh text. But you can see how this tool is something that's used by the British Library as well. But you can see the owners of this as well, which tells you further the importance of this manuscript. But sometimes they have too much written on the beginning of it. But you can see how you can look at this manuscript and go into fine detail of looking at it, which is what I love about these websites, because it can give you a sense of this manuscript without touching it, and it's not too blurry. You can actually interact with this in a really fantastic way. So this was something that they've started doing because of the pandemic, and I think is the best way to go about it, because you're protecting the pages and the manuscripts in the time being. So
they had a big fire, didn't they?
Yes.
So fire at that. I think this is a good idea. It's a good idea to digitalize everything, really.
And I think because there was one manuscript I was talking about that they had found in terms of the tsunami in 1607 or 1606, depending on what you look at. But they've decided to actually have one person touch it to actually take photos, and that was that. It goes into storage then because they felt like it was too delicate. So I think it definitely ensures that they're protected. And it's just a better way to look at things and more accessible at your home. You don't even have to pay for it, which is absolutely fantastic. Yes, I put the link in the chat, so I hope that's okay for you, Beth, and you can have a play around and explore there. I do that a little bit often, sometimes a little bit too much, but it is fantastic to actually look at that. Still would like it in my hands though. So thank you. Pat, is there anything that you'd like to ask or add as well?
No, fine. Yeah, it's interesting. And I've got to go to a few more monasteries, I think. I haven't been to one for a while, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think we need a little bit of spirituality in our lives sometimes. But thank you, Pat, and thank you everyone for today. And I'll see you next week.
Okie doke. Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.